So I'm not anticipating you necessarily knowing, all about letter forms and everything there is to know about topography. Again, it's something I would definitely invest in. I think in Digital Imaging 3, I don't teach that course. I do think they talk about topography to some extent, as well as maybe in some of the more advanced digital imaging courses, just because it's an important topic. But in a real broad sense, you can break down topography into types, categories. Okay, so again, I have this links to an article, and it will talk about different things as far as kind of what the other one was as well, talking about sort of the anatomy of type. But I would also suggest, which we're going to be doing shortly, is if you go to Google Fonts, which let me look that up, you will see that they will. That went way over here for some reason. You'll see that they actually will break the classifications down here. Okay, and so what I'll show you is this. Why is now I can't get it over? Hang on. Okay, so I'll show you this. So you can generally break down your typefaces into these major categories. Sometimes they'll be called other things, and I'll mention them underneath. So probably the most basic one here are your serifs and sans serifs. And broadly, you could break these down into these two categories as well, okay? So serif fonts means that they have serifs. It's the extra little bits. So if you look at the S, see how it's got that extra little line there, an extra little line there? They have these feet, right, on these characters as well. That is what makes a serif font a serif font. It's most typically, you're going to see it used in printed work, like a newspaper or a magazine. And the reason why it's used there is because by having these lines, these extra little serifs and feet and various other little extra bits, it actually makes it easier to see large amounts of text that are written across. So like if you have huge paragraphs, it'll be simpler to work with. Sans serif just means it doesn't have that. It's the cleanest typeface. It just has the bare bones of whatever makes each letter is what you see. It's a very usable, easy legible, basic typeface, and there are all sorts of them, like Arial and this Calibri one. There's a bunch of them that you will see. So sans serif, like all of my text here, this is all sans serif. There's no extra little bits. This will also be used for body body typefaces. So when I say body, this is a heading, and then this is a body, right? So you'll typically see these two used for those. Serif you'll see for printed, and sans serif you'll typically see for digital. The reason being is that if this serif is small, see how like this text is relatively small to see, those extra bits in there actually make it muddier and harder to read. So that's why sans serif is better for digital devices, for screens, while serif would typically be better for printed work. Okay. So that's kind of, and both of those are typically what you're going to see used for, like I said, body text. They're probably the least interesting of them, but they are also the most useful because they are the most legible. Monospace is sort of a unique situation. Monospace just means that every letter shares the exact same width. So a real good example is a typewriter. So if you look at anything written on a typewriter, it'll have that kind of, typically I think there's serif too, on the typewriter specifically, but you'll see that every foot, like when you type on the typewriter, right, a little foot comes up and it hits the paper. Every one of those has to be exactly the same size because it's not adjusting the spacing between all of them. They have to be exactly the same width so that when the little foot comes up, it'll match exactly where it's got to go. If some of the letters are wider or narrower, you're going to end up with gaps or overlaps between your letters. So every single letter has to be the same. It's not super used today. The one area where you will see it used, well, there's two main areas I can think of. One is coding. So you may have noticed when we've been coding, when we've been coding, this is all monospace. And the reason for that is because that way when we have our paragraphs, I'll just go back here again. That way when I write my stuff, like this row here, because it says blah, blah, blah row, or actually we use this row here. We're going to use this column here. That makes it easier. This column ends here, right? Well, see, this one's got different. But this one ends here. This one ends here. This one ends here. basically because every letter is exactly the same, the alignment is a lot easier to, it's very clean and easier to see how things are lined up because every letter is monospaced. So you'll see it a lot used in code because the formatting of the code matters more for legibility, so that I can understand how the code is being, that I can understand how things are lined up by tabs and such. Where I don't really care as much from like an aesthetic point of view. I'm just more worried about a functionality point of view. The other area that you will typically see monospace used are in scripts. So meaning like stuff that's written for film and video. And the reason for that is that if you have a 60-page script, that is a 60-minute, that's supposed to be 60 minutes. Every page should be equivalent to 1 minute. By having it monospace, it means there's the same number of characters on every page. I mean, depending on, hitting enter and stuff. But if they just completely filled it, it'd be the same number. So it ends up making time more correct by having it in a monospace format. If that makes sense. But notice these don't have to do with the aesthetic so much as they have to do with formatting. And so that's why monospace, unless you have a specific reason for it, like, oh, it's a cybersecurity website, you won't see it as much. But you will see it used in specific instances. There's probably some other ones I'm missing too, but those are the two ones I always think of. So script can also be known as handwriting, or sometimes they'll call it cursive. It's meant to mimic handwritten text. So for instance, I think it was Windows 95. Is that correct? Some of you guys might be more buffs than I am. That you might think of Comic Sans. That's a script, right? So it was meant to look like comic writing. But anytime you see like cursive type typefaces, anything that's meant to mimic a hand, that is done. That is a script type font. They're not super useful because, to be frank, I've had emails that people send me and they're in like the script, like cursive typeface, and it's hard to read. Particularly digitally, it's very difficult to read script. So unless you have a specific reason to use it, so you could use it in like your headings because that could be visually interesting. Most of the time, you're probably going to want them to be. You're probably not going to want to. You're not going to want to use it in body typefaces. You could potentially use it for some other ones. Like if you're doing a quote or something, that gives it a more like personal feel. But most of the time, you're going to find yourself not wanting to utilize it. And then display, and this is not a good example because it's just another script typeface. Display, or sometimes they'll call it decorative or fantasy. Those are the most interesting visual typefaces. Those are your really weird ones where it's like, it's a typeface, but it's made out of a bunch of leaves, or it's like people or something like that. Or like what I was saying earlier, like the Goosebumps or Blood font or the Ransom fonts. Those are all display. The really kind of complicated, visually interesting typefaces, but they're usually also going to be hardest to read, even more so than the script one. So they absolutely should never be used as body typefaces. You do not want to use them in large amounts of text. But they are good to use for heading, especially main headings like the site name. You could use that because you could kind of use it as a sort of brand as well. Some brands have their own typefaces specifically for them. So, like Coca-Cola or Pepsi, they have their own typeface, and then they use that, but they won't use it throughout all of it. They won't even do their subtitles, right? They won't even do heading 2s and 3s. They'll just use it on heading 1s. But it's good to draw people in. But the longer it is, the more difficult it's going to be to read. So like you'd want to do it as like single word or a couple of words, but not a whole large sentence, if that makes sense. But like I said, they are the most visually interesting. And if you go here and we went to, let's go over here, did it again. And I did display fonts. You're going to see it's going to give me, that's not a very fancy one, but you're going to see it's going to give me these ones that are a little bit more interesting, but they're not going to function as well. I think that one's okay. So anyway, that's the idea with that. Okay. So, can make a big difference. But you do want to spend a lot of time thinking about the typeface. Large companies, they have, their marketing department will be like, we use this typeface for all whatever and this for what have you. So they'll have a brand guide that will kind of outline how to, what typefaces use and how to use them.